Howdy. A couple of videos ago, I mentioned that my mother is now living in the house with my wife and I. And it's been an interesting experience. Well, I had to get her a doctor because she had a doctor where she lived, but now that we're not going to be going up there anymore because I had to move her where I live and we're about, 90 minutes away, I had to get her a new doctor. So I was able to get this doctor, and now we're in the process of trying to move medical records from her previous doctor to this doctor, and I haven't met this doctor yet. Mom will have the appointment in March. So what happens is I get a phone call from the office of the new doctor, and they said they'd like to ask me some questions. I said, okay, sure. And I'm thinking they're going to look for insurance information so they can, get on top of that because I'm a finance guy in healthcare. That's what I would do. Instead, they wanted to ask me a bunch of questions about her medical history. And the strange thing is that I may be 57 years old, but truthfully, there's a lot about my mother I don't know regarding her medical history. For instance, they asked me if she'd ever had any operations, to which I said, well, I really don't know. I would have known if she'd had an operation when I was living with her. But truth of the matter is, when we weren't living together, I found out later on that there were a couple of times that my dad ended up having to rush my mother to the emergency room, but they didn't tell me at the time until much later. So I don't know if she'd had an operation. And then she asked me if she'd ever had a C-section, to which I said, well, you know what, I'm the only child, and if she had one, they certainly never told me. And she said, okay, I understand that. And so there were a lot of these questions that this lady asked me that I just couldn't answer. And I thought about that because I said, well, geez, you know what? There's a lot I know about my mother, but there's just tons I don't know. And I've lived with this woman. I've known this woman for, 57 years. Okay, I may have really known her for only 54 or 55 because I can't remember a lot of those early years, but still, that's a long time. Well, if I don't know her all that well, then what makes me think that I really understand employees all that well? Or other people I work with. As a consultant, I meet with a lot of independent people. And, I have gotten to that point now where I'm recognizing I really don't know anybody. And so I think that even though I can be friendly and open and whatever, and people say, oh, you're just the nicest guy, truth of the matter is, I'm a bit reserved because you really can't know a lot of people. How can I know them if I just met them? Even after a couple of years, I'm very good at picking friends. For the most part. I've only missed a couple of times ever in my life. Most of the time I'm very good because I'm very deliberate, I'm very picky. Still, you don't know everything about everyone's life. How many people find out that someone they knew has done something bad, or suddenly someone does something bad and they say, wow, I didn't know they were capable of that. About 4 or 5 years ago, there was a guy living across the street from my mother. And he was a nice guy. I mean, I met him in 1993 after we had one of the biggest storms in history, one of the biggest winter storms. As a matter of fact, it's ranked as the #1 winter storm. And it was in the Syracuse area, although my parents lived in the Rochester area, where they had 28 inches. And in, where I live, we had 43 inches. It pretty much buried us. And that was just us. Further north, some of those people had over 100 inches of snow in about 24-hour period. That's just amazing. Anyway, this is what we have. Anyway, we kind of got buried. And my dad had a bad back. Mom certainly wasn't going to help, but we went out there and we tried to do whatever we could. And the snow was as high as my car because I went to my parents' house for that. Just to, I don't know why I went there, but I went there and we were buried. I mean, the snow was at the top of my car and I didn't have a small car at the time. So it was at the top of my car. So we're trying to get in and we're totally, dug into the snow. And the guy across the street happens to see us, and I don't know how he saw us. He almost had to have been on a second level because the big plow had come and it had brought the snowbank, well, at least 4.5 feet up. I mean, I could see over it and Dad could see over it, but it wasn't easy. So he came over and he had a snowblower, which is something my dad didn't own at the time, and I lived in an apartment, so I certainly didn't own it. And he helped us to clear this path because my grandmother was living with my parents, and she had had times where she had to go to the hospital as well. So we were out there trying to clear a path just so that we could kind of get to the street. And then, of course, we knew we were going to have to try to clear a path so that we could get cars out. So this guy came over, and it was the nicest thing. And my dad got to know him a little bit better. They would talk. He had a, wife and daughter, and the daughter loved my dad, and everything was going well. And then my dad passed away, and for the first time in goodness, almost 35 years, I cried. And the time I cried, he was there. I mean, he's there in my dad's house. I hadn't cried in 35 years. So you're thinking, okay, I don't see this guy all the time, but I kind of know him. But I started thinking after a certain period that there was something about him. I have never taken any drugs, but I went to college and I was in music, and I've met people who have. And I started seeing some symptoms, but I wasn't really sure what was going on. Meanwhile, in this guy's life, he'd gotten divorced from the first wife. He'd gotten divorced from, actually, it turned out she was the second wife. I didn't know he had a first wife. I didn't know he had a third wife. By the time I saw him with someone else, it turned out that was wife number 4. And I was like, wow, what's going on? And then he killed wife number 4 in the house across the street from my mother. This nice guy basically started doing all kind of drugs, and I had told my mother, I think he's on cocaine or something, because I've seen those symptoms before. He killed his wife and then basically sat there with the house totally locked up so that the kids, when they came home, they were her kids, couldn't get in the house. They ended up having to call the police. The police were able to get into the house, and he's in the living room holding his dead wife in his arms, crying over her with blood everywhere. And you're thinking, what? This guy? And I'm not mentioning any names, but I'm like, wow, how the heck? And it shows, you don't always know someone, because then later on, I got a little history, and it turns out that one of the things he was doing was he was physically abusing all of his wives. I never knew that. I guess at a certain point, how do we know? I mean, we hear about this kind of thing all the time, and we never know what's going on behind someone else's doors. And I just thought how freaky that was. And the reason I'm talking about these types of things is because I hear a lot of people saying, well, I know my employees, and I know this is what they want, and blah, blah, blah. And I always say, well, how do you know? I mean, are you Kreskin? And for you younger people, go look that up on Google, because I don't want to explain who Kreskin is. But in essence, he was a mentalist. And that's not going to help either, so I'll just say he pretended to be a mind reader. And they say, well, no, it's just that I watch the signs. I said, oh, really? I used to ask them. And I did. I asked people, what do you want? I met more often than just once a year for employee reviews. I would bring people in office, and I would say, okay, let's talk about some things here. And say, okay, what would you want? Do you want to have a path towards leadership? Do you want a little bit more freedom? Do you want a little bit more instruction? What do you want? Is your supervisor treating you nice, or are they treating you mean, or what are you seeing here? And I would talk to people, because I always felt that you're never really going to know everybody. But one of the things you hope to do is to be able to at least control as much situation as possible, if that's your responsibility. And if you're in a leadership position, that really is your responsibility. But you can't think that you ever know everything about someone. You may not be close to it. I mean, there are some times where there are signs that you're overlooking, or you see them but you can't do anything about it. For instance, when I would notice that there were employees, and this never happened to an employee who worked for me, but I would see certain employees within the hospital I worked at where you would see the bruises and you would see something else, and there was nothing you could do about it. You might ask someone, how are you doing? Oh, I'm fine. I fell down the steps. I did this, whatever. You know what the truth is, but you also know there's nothing you can do about it. You just never understand how people really are, even if you're in the house with them all the time. You can get pretty close. You can guess a lot of things. You can guess big picture things. But deep down, you never know. Think about John Wayne Gacy. How many people did he kill? Yet he was traveling around being a clown at children's parties, and people loved this guy? I'm just saying. So The takeaway from this is to don't assume that you always know what's going on in someone else's life. Don't assume that you always know what your employees are doing or what they know. You need to find out. You need to be willing to ask questions. You need to be observant. And you need to take care of your business, because that's what leadership's all about. I hope I've gotten this across. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, if you have any statements, please let me know. Y'all take care.